Dust coated their teeth as the radio clicked dead. 3 men lay pinned magazines dry, tracking the crunch of footsteps closing in over the jagged rock. No one spoke. They just waited for the inevitable. Then a single deafening crack shattered the valley. 1.338 Lapua round. Their executioner dropped. The heat in the valley didn't just radiate, it pressed down like a physical weight. It was 114 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. Chief Petty Officer Donovan tasted copper and stale dirt. He lay flat against the shale, his cheek pressed so hard into the jagged rock he was sure it was bleeding. Next to him, Miller was trying to clear a double feed in his Mark 48 machine gun, his thick fingers slipping on the hot metal. Griggs the medic was curled behind the rusted-out carcass of a Soviet-era transport truck, clutching a rifle that had gone dry 3 minutes ago. They had been walking for 6 hours, a standard reconnaissance patrol that was supposed to map a suspected transit route. Intelligence had said the valley was empty. Intelligence had been wrong. It started with a single snap, the unmistakable supersonic crack of a round passing inches from Donovan's ear. Before the sound of the gunshot even reached them, the hillside erupted. It wasn't a handful of insurgents taking potshots. It was a coordinated L-shaped ambush. Heavy machine guns chewed through the sparse brush, turning rocks into deadly shrapnel. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked down from the high ground, detonating with concussive force that rattled the teeth in Donovan's skull. "Get off the X!" Donovan had roared, but there was nowhere to go. The wadi they had been traversing offered a deceptive illusion of cover. Now it was a trench, and they were at the bottom of it. They scrambled backward boots, slipping on loose scree, until they hit the bottleneck of the canyon wall. A dead end. "I can't get it," Miller grunted. Blood was welling from a deep laceration above his left eye, blinding him on one side. He slammed the charging handle of the heavy weapon, but the casing was wedged tight in the chamber. Donovan popped out from behind a slab of limestone, brought his M4 up, and fired a quick 3-round burst at a muzzle flash on the ridge. Click. He dropped back down, swapping magazines with practiced mechanical efficiency. He didn't look at the magazine as he seated it. He just felt the weight. It was his last one. "Griggs!" Donovan shouted over the deafening roar of incoming fire. The enemy was using PKM machine guns, the heavy 7.62 by 54mm rounds, tearing chunks out of the limestone above their heads. Griggs looked over his face, pale beneath a thick layer of grime. He held up his chest rig. The pouches were flat. "Dry, boss. I got my sidearm and 1 frag." Donovan swallowed hard. The spit in his mouth felt like sandpaper. He keyed his radio. "Havoc Base, this is Viper 1. We are pinned, taking heavy contact from multiple elevated positions. We are black on ammo. I repeat, black on ammo. Requesting immediate close air." Static hissed in his earpiece. The jagged terrain of the valley, combined with whatever jamming equipment the ambushers had dragged up the mountain, rendered the radio useless. They were entirely cut off. "Havoc Base, Viper 1, do you copy?" More static. Donovan let his hand drop from the push-to-talk switch. He looked at Miller, who had finally abandoned the jammed Mark 48 and drawn his Sig Sauer P226, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at Griggs, who was methodically checking the action of his pistol, his eyes hollow. They were dead. It was a cold, cynical realization. There would be no dramatic rescue, no helicopter cresting the ridge at the last second. They were 3 men in a ditch, vastly outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of bullets. The enemy fire was slowing down, shifting from sustained, suppressing bursts to deliberate, targeted single shots. They were maneuvering. They were closing the net. Donovan checked his own rifle. 20 rounds left. He checked his sidearm. 15. 35 bullets against at least 40 fighters advancing down the scree slopes. "Listen up," Donovan said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't offer a motivational speech. There was no point. They were Tier 1 operators. They knew the math. They're flanking left and right. When they crest that berm at 30 meters, we dump everything we have. We don't die with rounds in the magazines. Miller spat a mouthful of blood and dust onto the rocks. "Copy that, Chief." Griggs nodded slowly. "See you on the other side, boys." They settled in. The silence between the enemy gunshots was heavy, suffocating. They could hear the clatter of loose rocks now, the sound of footsteps, the guttural shouts of the fighters communicating, coordinating their final assault. They were taking their time. They knew they had won. Donovan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He didn't pray for a miracle. He prayed his hands wouldn't shake when he pulled the trigger for the last time. 50 meters, 40 meters. Donovan tightened his grip on the rifle. He could see the tops of their heads now, the barrels of their AK-47s cresting the dirt berm. Wait for it, he told himself. Make them count. 2,000 yards away, across a sprawling expanse of jagged granite and heat, Shimmer Morgan Hayes was fighting a different kind of war. She had been detached from the main element before dawn, tasked with securing a high-angle overwatch position on the eastern ridge. The climb had been brutal. 4 hours of hauling herself and 40 pounds of gear up a sheer rock face in the pitch black. Her fingertips were torn and bleeding through her gloves, her muscles screaming with lactic acid. She had reached the nest just as the sun crested the horizon, settling into a shallow depression between two boulders. She deployed the bipod of her Macmillan Taig, .338 sniper rifle, draped her camouflage netting over her shoulders, and began scanning. Then the ambush happened. Morgan had watched it unfold through the high-powered optics of her scope, a silent, horrifying movie playing out in the valley below. She saw the trap spring. She saw her team get pushed back, pinned, and systematically isolated. She keyed her radio repeatedly, trying to warn them, trying to coordinate with Havoc Base, but the signal was dead. The mountains swallowed every transmission. She was alone, just a woman, a rifle, and a terrifying amount of distance. The rangefinder read 1,840 meters, over a mile. In ideal conditions on a flat range with no wind, a shot at that distance was a monumental task. Here the conditions were a nightmare. The heat radiating off the valley floor created a mirage that made the target area ripple and distort like water. The wind was chaotic, blowing right to left at the peak, swirling in the valley, and completely stagnant at the target. She watched through the glass as Donovan, Miller, and Griggs stopped moving. She saw the dust kicking up around them. She saw Miller ditch his heavy machine gun. They're black, she realized. They're out of ammo. Her breathing slowed. The frantic desperation that had gripped her chest dissolved into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. Panic wouldn't save them. Only math and violence could do that. Morgan reached up and dialed the elevation turret on her scope. Click, click, click. She adjusted for the drop of the heavy .338 Lapua Magnum bullet over 1,840 meters. It was a massive holdover. If she was off by a fraction of a millimeter, the bullet would hit the dirt 50 feet short or sail harmlessly over the mountain. She studied the wind. She watched the dust kicking up from the enemy's boots. She watched the sparse tufts of dry grass on the slopes. Wind is 8 knots full value from the right at the target, 12 knots half value in the mid-flight. She dialed her windage. Through the scope, she saw the enemy fighters begin their final advance. They were standing up now, moving confidently down the slope toward the wadi where her team was trapped. They were bunched together. Cocky, Morgan found the lead fighter. He was a large man wearing a woodland camouflage jacket barking orders and pointing an AK-47 down into the trench. He was 30 meters from Donovan. She exhaled, one long, steady breath. She let her lungs empty completely, finding that natural respiratory pause where the human body is perfectly still. Her heart beat once, twice. Her finger squeezed the two-stage trigger. The Macmillan roared a concussive blast that kicked the heavy stock hard into her shoulder and sent a cloud of dust blooming around her hide. The bullet left the barrel at over 2,900 feet per second. It tore through the thin mountain air, fighting gravity, fighting the wind. The flight time was nearly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where Morgan lay perfectly still, recovering from the recoil, watching the trace of the bullet disturb the air like a localized sonic boom. Down in the wadi, Donovan was raising his rifle, preparing to fire his last 20 rounds. The large fighter on the berm was raising his weapon, a cruel smile, visible even through the dirt and distance. Then the fighter's head snapped violently backward, atomizing in a pink mist. A fraction of a second later, the thundering crack of the supersonic round echoed through the canyon, followed by the deep, distant boom of the rifle. The fighter's body collapsed dead before it hit the shale. Donovan froze. Miller lowered his pistol. On the ridge, the remaining enemy fighters stopped dead in their tracks, confusion washing over them. They looked around, trying to source the sound, trying to understand why their leader had just dropped. Up in the nest, Morgan didn't hesitate. She had her dope. The math was right. She worked the bolt action with lightning speed. The spent brass casing flew out, pinging against the rock, and a fresh round slammed into the chamber. She acquired the next target, a fighter carrying an RPG. Breathe out, pause, squeeze. The rifle roared again. 3 seconds later, the RPG gunner was picked up and thrown backward as the massive .338 round punched through his chest plate. Panic erupted on the berm. The enemy fighters realized they weren't the ambushers anymore. They were in a crossfire, and the fire coming from the sky was brutally accurate. They broke cover, scrambling to get back behind the rocks, firing wildly up into the hills. "Holy shit!" Miller breathed, staring at the crumpled bodies. Donovan looked up at the eastern ridge. He couldn't see anything, just glare and rock. But he knew exactly who was up there. "Hayes," Donovan whispered. A grim, filthy smile cracked his dirt-caked face. She made the climb. Another booming crack echoed across the valley. Another fighter who had tried to flank right folded completely in half and tumbled down the scree slope. The dynamic had shifted. The sheer kinetic energy of the .338 rounds was psychologically devastating. It wasn't the suppressed rapid-fire pop of assault rifles. It was the methodical, terrifying sound of a scythe falling. Morgan was in a rhythm now. Bolt, target, breathe, fire. Her shoulder throbbed with every recoil, but she tuned it out. The brass piled up beside her, hot and smoking. The barrel of the Macmillan began to radiate heat, adding its own mirage to her scope. But she compensated, reading the distortion like a second language. Down in the dirt, the pinned men didn't just watch. They capitalized. "Move," Donovan barked. "While she has them pinned, grab Miller." They didn't have ammo to fight. But Morgan was buying them the one thing they needed: time. Griggs hooked his arm under Miller's shoulder, half dragging the bleeding machine gunner toward a deeper recess in the wadi, a small cave carved out by centuries of flash floods. Morgan tracked their movement through the scope, acting as their guardian angel. A fighter popped up from behind a rusted car door, aiming down at Griggs. Morgan's crosshairs found his center of mass. "Send it." The car door buckled inward, exploding in a shower of rust and shrapnel as the armor-piercing round tore through the metal and the man behind it. She had fired 10 rounds, 10 precise, devastating shots. The enemy assault had completely shattered. The fighters were screaming at each other, dragging their wounded, retreating back up the treacherous slopes to escape the invisible sniper. But Morgan knew the math of the battlefield just as well as she knew the math of ballistics. She had 30 rounds of .338 on her. The enemy still had numbers, and eventually they would figure out her exact position. When they did, they would turn those heavy PKMs and RPGs on her nest, and the overwatch advantage would vanish. She racked the bolt chambering round number 11. Her eye never left the glass. The bleeding on her fingers had made the bolt slippery, the grip of the rifle slick. She wiped her hand on her dusty trousers and settled back in. "You wanted to hold the high ground." Haze, she thought to herself, the cynical voice in her head cutting through the adrenaline. Now you're stuck on it. The sun began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the western peaks, casting long, deceptive shadows across the shale. The temperature dropped a fraction, but the rocks still radiated oven-like heat. Up in her nest, Morgan felt the wind shift. The stagnant air in the valley started to churn, pulling the dust into erratic, swirling dust devils. It made the math harder. It made the shots near impossible. The enemy had stopped running. The initial shock of the sniper fire had worn off, replaced by a hardened, tactical resolve. They were seasoned fighters, survivors of a dozen brutal campaigns, and they understood geometry. They traced the trajectory of the falling bodies, the angle of the entry wounds, the microscopic delay between the supersonic crack and the rifle's report. They found her. It started with a single probing burst of PKM fire. The heavy 7.62 rounds impacted the granite face 30 feet below Morgan's ledge, sending up plumes of pulverized grey dust. She didn't flinch. She kept her eye glued to the ocular lens, scanning the chaotic terrain. "Come on," she whispered. Her lips cracked and bleeding. "Show yourself." A muzzle flash winked from a cluster of boulders 400 yards up the valley slope. Before the sound reached her, a second burst hammered the rock right below her firing port. Fragments of granite exploded inward, a razor-sharp chip slicing across her cheek. The sting was sharp, immediate, but she ignored the warm trickle of blood running down her jawline. She dialed her windage knob, accounting for the new updraft. She settled the crosshairs on the gap between the boulders. Breathe. Squeeze. The TAC 338 roared. The recoil punched her bruised shoulder. Through the glass, she saw a fighter slump sideways out of the rocks, his weapon clattering down the slope. But the muzzle flash had been bait. From a higher elevation on the opposite ridge, an RPG gunner stepped out from behind a scrub oak. He didn't aim at her precisely, he just aimed at the ledge. The rocket streaked across the canyon, a fiery comet, trailing dirty grey smoke. Morgan dropped the rifle and threw herself backward into the shallow depression of her hide. The warhead slammed into the overhang above her position. The world turned into a deafening, concussive void. The shockwave compressed her lungs, forcing the air out of her chest in a violent gasp. A shower of dirt, loose shale, and jagged rock rained down, burying her legs and coating her rifle in a thick layer of grit. For 10 seconds, Morgan couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched, agonizing ring. She tasted cordite and copper. She coughed, spitting thick black dust onto the rocks. She crawled back to the rifle. The scope cover was cracked, but the glass was intact. She wiped the objective lens with a filthy sleeve and pulled the weapon tight against her shoulder. Down in the cave, Donovan felt the mountains shake. He watched the plume of black smoke billow out from the eastern ridge. "They found her," Miller rasped, pressing a blood-soaked field dressing against his eye. His voice was tight with pain and exhaustion. Griggs was tying off the bandage. "She's taking the whole valley's aggro chief. If they pin her, they'll flank us again. Donovan stared out at the wadi. 30 meters away lay the body of the first fighter Morgan had killed. Next to his outstretched hand was a battered AK-47 and a chest rig stuffed with magazines. 30 meters of open, jagged shale covered by at least 2 enemy machine guns. It was a suicide run, but dying in a hole with an empty rifle wasn't an option. "Griggs," Donovan said, his voice flat. "When I move, you throw that frag. Over the berm toward the eastern slope. Make it loud." Griggs didn't argue. He pulled the M67 fragmentation grenade from his webbing and gripped the pin. Donovan checked his boots, ensuring the laces were tight. He dropped his empty M4, drawing his SIG P226, 15 rounds. He took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline flood his system, pushing the fatigue into a dark corner of his mind. "Go!" Donovan barked. Griggs pulled the pin, cooked it for one terrifying second, and hurled the heavy green sphere over the rock wall. Donovan exploded out of the cave. The grenade detonated with a sharp concussive crack, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. For 2 seconds, the enemy fire ceased, startled by the sudden explosion. Donovan didn't run in a straight line. He scrambled, dropped, rolled, and pushed off the rocks, moving with a desperate, animalistic speed. The shale chewed at his knees and elbows. 50 feet, 40 feet. The enemy machine gunner on the western ridge spotted the movement. The PKM opened up the rounds, chasing Donovan across the dirt, kicking up geysers of dust inches from his boots. Up in the nest, Morgan fought through the ringing in her ears. She saw the tracers reaching out toward the wadi. She saw Donovan sprinting for the dead fighter. She didn't have time to calculate the wind perfectly. She didn't have time to dial the turrets. She used the reticle holding over the target in a frantic, instinctual estimation. She slammed the bolt forward, seated around, and fired. The PKM gunner's weapon abruptly silenced as the .338 round obliterated the rock he was using for cover, sending secondary shrapnel tearing through his arms and chest. Donovan hit the dirt next to the dead fighter. He didn't stop moving. He grabbed the AK by the hot barrel, ripped the chest rig off the corpse, and rolled violently backward into a shallow depression just as a new volley of AK fire tore up the ground where he had been a second before. He checked the captured weapon. The dust cover was missing, the bolt was rusted, and the wood furniture was splintered. He racked the action. It felt like grinding sand. He aimed blindly over the lip of the depression and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked violently, spitting a loud rhythmic burst of 7.6, 2x39mm fire toward the advancing fighters. Down in the cave, Griggs laughed a harsh, cracking sound. "He's got a gun!" Up on the ridge, Morgan smiled grimly. The math was changing again. The shadows swallowed the valley floor, turning the jagged rocks into a monochrome landscape of grey and black. The heat mirage vanished, replaced by a cold, biting mountain draft that cut through Morgan's sweat-soaked uniform. She had 4 rounds left. The brass casings around her were cold now. The barrel of the Macmillan had cooled. The battle had devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate. The enemy fighters were terrified of the high ground, refusing to expose themselves, but they kept a steady, suppressing fire on the cave and Donovan's crater. They were waiting for nightfall. Once it was dark, the snipers' advantage would neutralize, and they could overrun the Americans with sheer numbers. Donovan knew it too. He was firing single measured shots from the captured AK, just enough to keep the enemy heads down. He had 2 magazines left. Morgan pressed her face against the stock. She scanned the shadows, looking for thermal cues, looking for the slight disruption of the brush. Her right eye throbbed from the constant strain. 4 rounds, she muttered to the wind. Suddenly, a sharp digital tone cut through the static in her earpiece. It wasn't voice comms. It was the emergency beacon transponder, finally catching a bounce off a low-orbiting satellite or a high-altitude drone. The jamming net had a blind spot, and the shifting temperature had opened a propagation window. 30 seconds later, a heavily staticked mechanical voice broke the silence. Viper, this, Havoc, authenticate. Over. Morgan jammed her thumb onto the push-to-talk button. Havoc, this is Viper Overwatch. Authentication Juliet Tango Niner. We are in a broken arrow situation. Viper 1 is pinned black on ammo, multiple casualties. Enemy force is 40+ heavily armed. Requesting immediate CAS. Grid is 094 tactically engaged. The static hissed, long and agonizing. Viper Overwatch, Havoc, solid copy. Fast movers are inbound. ETA 2 mics. Keep your heads down. Morgan exhaled a breath. She felt like she'd been holding for 3 hours. She didn't cheer. She chambered her third-to-last round. 2 minutes. In a gunfight, 2 minutes was a lifetime. The enemy seemed to sense the shift. Perhaps they heard the distant high-altitude whine of jet engines, or perhaps they just realized the sun was gone. The assault began anew. A dozen fighters broke from the western ridge, charging down the slope toward Donovan's position, screaming guttural war cries. They abandoned cover, relying on speed and suppressing fire. Donovan dumped his second-to-last magazine into the charging mass, dropping 2, but the AK jammed hard, a stovepipe failure that refused to clear. He threw the useless weapon down and drew his pistol. Morgan tracked the lead fighter. She fired. The man dropped. She worked the bolt. 2 rounds left. She fired again, hitting a fighter in the thigh, spinning him violently into the dirt. 1 round left. She chambered it. She didn't fire. She watched through the scope as the fighters closed to within 20 meters of Donovan. He was shooting his pistol now, his stance wide bracing for the inevitable end. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a sound you heard. It was a sound you felt in your organs. The deep, terrifying mechanical roar of the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, and a 10 Thunderbolt II came screaming down the valley trench, flying so low Morgan could see the rivets on the titanium tub. The nose of the ugly grey jet erupted in a 30-foot tongue of flame. Brrrr! The sound of the gun firing reached them a second after the impact. The western slope simply disintegrated. 2-pound depleted uranium shells slammed into the rock at 3,000 feet per second, vaporizing the advancing fighters, shattering the boulders, and turning the ridge into a churning cloud of fire and pulverized granite. The ground shook so violently, Morgan's rifle bipod bounced off the rock. The A-10 banked hard, pulling up into the darkening sky, dropping a string of brilliant white flares that illuminated the carnage below. The enemy assault completely collapsed. The survivors broke and ran, abandoning their weapons, scrambling blindly up the eastern slopes, desperate to escape the flying gun. A second A-10 came in behind the first, dropping a pair of 500-pound JDAMs on the enemy's staging area behind the berm. The concussive shock waves rolled up the mountain, hitting Morgan's nest, like a physical blow raining more dirt down on her back. Then it was quiet. The ringing in Morgan's ears returned, accompanied by the crackle of burning brush in the valley. She didn't move for a long time. She just lay there, her finger resting outside the trigger guard, staring at the empty, smoking crater where the enemy had been. Viper Overwatch. Donovan's voice crackled over the radio, crystal clear now that the jamming equipment was atomized. His voice was exhausted, devoid of any Hollywood triumph. Status. Morgan pressed the transmit button. Overwatch is green, 1 round left. Save it for the walk home, Donovan replied. Get down here, Hayes. Medevac is 5 mics out. Morgan sat up. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her hands were bruised. Her face was covered in dried blood and soot, and she was so dehydrated her tongue felt swollen. She methodically cleared the chamber, catching the unfired .338 round as it popped out. She placed it in her pocket. She packed up the heavy Macmillan, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, and began the long, brutal climb down into the dark. When she finally reached the wadi, the dust from the incoming Black Hawk was already whipping through the canyon. Donovan was sitting on a rock, smoking a crushed, dusty cigarette he'd found in his rig. Griggs was holding an IV bag over Miller, who was pale but breathing steady. Donovan looked up as Morgan approached. He didn't stand. He didn't salute. He just took a long drag of the cigarette, the cherry glowing bright in the gloom. He offered the cigarette to her. Morgan took it. She took a slow drag, letting the harsh smoke fill her lungs, staring at the ruined valley. She handed it back. "Nice shooting," Donovan said quietly. "Math," Morgan replied, her voice hoarse. They didn't say anything else. They just waited in the dirt for the helicopter to take them away from the kill box, knowing the only thing waiting for them back at base was a debrief, a few hours of sleep, and the terrifying certainty that they would have to do it all again. The battlefield doesn't care about heroics. It only respects geometry, physics, and the cold discipline to execute under fire. Morgan Hayes proved that a single rifle guided by absolute precision can rewrite the math of an unwinnable fight. If this gritty, grounded look into the silent, devastating world of Tier 1 Overwatch kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video to support these stories and subscribe for more uncompromising tactical narratives. Stay sharp.